right, so now we have to talk, so let's talk about Shabtai Tzvi, and then let's see if we can then make connections. So, the story of Shabtai Tzvi, I assume most of you at least know the very broad outline. Born in Smyrna, makes his way to Egypt, starts doing all kinds of strange things, which are described in this brilliant work by Gershon Sholem called Shabtai Tzvi, the Mystical Messiah. Big, big book. All right, so now we're going to write down a bunch of historians. Sholem. Marries someone, divorces, marries a Torah. I don't know if he divorced the Torah or not, but does all kinds of very strange, bizarre things. Finally makes his way up the coast through Gaza. Here's where Gaza is important for Jewish history other than the Palestinian conflict. And he meets there a man named Natan Ha'azati, or Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan is a kind of prophet, a kind of political advisor. You might even argue he even shapes Shabtai Tzvi, who, if you follow Gershon Sholem's understanding of him, Shabtai Tzvi was a kind of manic depressive, very happy at times, very sad at other times, very withdrawn, and all of these behavior patterns could be interpreted in a mystical way. More recently, Moshe Idel has argued that his illness was melancholia, from the word Shabtai. What does Shabtai mean in English, in European languages? Shabtai is one of the planets, particularly Saturnus, Saturn. Saturn is the star of melancholia. Now, Saturn, under Saturn, you get melancholia. You know, Robert Burton's very famous book on melancholia. This was a classic work of the early modern period, in which he describes the Saturnal disease, which is the disease, by the way, which Jews get especially. Melancholia. Anybody in this room ever get melancholia? Sometimes I feel a little bit, you know. So I identify. But anyway, the fact that his name is Shabtai, melancholia, and of course, then Idel puts it in a kind of astrological context, which is very, very interesting. But let's stay with the manic depressive. How do you say manic depressive in Spanish? Okay, all right. As long as you understand. Nobody has that here. Okay. All right. So in any case, he meets Nathan and he goes to Jerusalem and he declares himself the Messiah in 1665, 1666. And then, of course, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Basically, he is caught by the officials. Notice how this story sounds like Jesus. You know, he's caught in Jerusalem, and so on. There's a very interesting parallel here. But he's taken to an Ottoman jail, and he's saying, you know, either be a Messiah or convert to Islam, and he converts to Islam. So now he's a Muslim, but his followers really believe in him. Now I'm giving you the narrative according to Sholem in very, very quick terms. So the question is, what do you do if you're a believer in the Messiah and the Messiah is converted to Islam? I mean, it's the same question that was raised by the followers of Jesus. What do you do when the Messiah is killed on a cross? You know, is he still the Messiah? And you need some kind of explanation, some kind of way of explaining a paradox. The paradox of a Messiah dying on a cross, or the paradox of a Messiah converting to Islam. Jewish Messiahs don't convert to Islam usually, right? Unless you're the Islamic Messiah. So there are radical solutions and there are moderate solutions. The radical Sabbateans, the followers of Shabtai Tzvi, decide to convert to Islam as well, to follow the Messiah step by step. And they do so, and this is a group called the Donmeh. And they go underground, and they do all kinds of very strange things, orgies, and all kinds of very interesting things. Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish writer, was extremely enchanted by these groups and wrote many novels. And one of them is called Satan and Gory, which is describes their sexual acts and all kinds of things. Really, it's the kind of thing you should make into a movie, X-rated. And so you have the radicals. The most radical of all is a guy named Jacob Frank, who appears later on in the 18th century and declares that he is the Gilgul, how do you say, transmigration of the Messiah, and that we need to convert to Christianity. I will come back to this point when I talk about mingled identities, because notice that here is a messianic movement, which is you're only fulfilled by becoming either a Muslim or a Christian. That's clearly mingled identities, no? So that's really quite interesting, what is going on. So the radicals essentially break the law. Now, the one piece that I've left out in Sholom's analysis, which I don't have the time really to explore in great detail, but he argues that not any specific historical act triggered all of this, but rather the diffusion of Lurianic Kabbalah and Kabbalistic ideas, particularly the idea of the breaking of the vessels, which is a concept whereby the sparks of God are nestled into these vessels, which are then broken and spread all over the universe, and thus evil is spread, and these sparks, the divine sparks, are held in captivity by the evil klipa, and we must somehow fix the situation through tikkun. Tikkun is the final process of restitution of the sparks, bringing together the sparks. So what is the Messiah doing? The Messiah is going down to the realm of the klipa, fighting with the klipa, wrestling with the klipa, and removing the sparks and bringing them back. So the Messiah is accelerating the process by which we bring about the messianic end. All right? In other words, but the Messiah, by doing evil, meets evil. Minus times minus, that's my only math I know. Minus times minus equals plus, right? That's the idea here. Minus times minus equals plus. So by fighting, wrestling with the klipa, we transform. Evil is good. So in other words, or to put it in the language of the Sabbateans, ha-mitzvah haba'a be'avirah, a commandment which comes out of sin, the holiness of sin. In other words, by doing evil, you do good, really. So kind of transvaluation of values, right? That's Nietzsche. All right. So that's the idea. So that explains, in other words, for him, an intellectual explanation, Sholom argued. And this was a brilliant work, which had a tremendous impact, and it still has impact. Eventually published in the English edition in the 1970s, published in the Hebrew edition in the 50s or 60s, I don't remember exactly when. And enormous. It was the first book I ever read in Hebrew as a graduate student was Shabtai Tzvi. I read it from cover to cover, and I got to the word antinomianism, and I kept looking it up in every Hebrew dictionary, and I couldn't figure out what the hell the word meant. And then I realized it was an English word, antinomian, against the law, antinomianism. Anyway, so that's Sholom. Sholom's so if they're radical Sabbateans, then they're also moderate Sabbateans. So he mentioned the whole group of people. I'm not going to mention a lot of names. Heschel Hatzoreif, Yudah Hasid, Yonatan Eibeshitz, and so on. People who continued to observe Jewish law and not break Jewish law. The radical Sabbateans had broken Jewish law in the name of the Messiah. In other words, here was ultimately, and of course Sholom builds this whole story, which begins with Maimonides' code of Jewish law, Maimonides' concern that Messianism can somehow overturn normative Judaism, the laws of Judaism. And now it finally explodes. Everything goes wrong. Now, in the name of the Messiah, you can break Jewish law. You don't need rabbis. You don't need authority. You don't need nomus. And thus, in a Messianic age, the Messiah is the authority, not the rabbis. The moderate Sabbateans, however, say we must observe the law, we must observe the rabbis, we must wait until the public appearance of the Messiah and the Messianic age. So they live with the psychology of kriya balev, as we say in Hebrew, a ripped heart. They know something is wrong, but they still living with the moment of still living within the nomos, living within the law. Okay, but nevertheless, they're suspect. For example, one of the most interesting characters in this regard is Jonathan Eibeshitz. I'll come back to him several times. I'm going to come back to him today, and also, in my first hour and my second hour as well. All right, so that's Shalom. Now, I'm not going to give you 100 names here because there are 100 names, but let me mention just a few. So, when Shalom died, immediately his critics came out of the woodwork to raise questions about this wonderful and very dramatic reconstruction of Jewish history. So they include Edel and Liebes. I can't tell whether Liebes is I-E or E-S, or I-E or E-I.
Liebes.
E-I, I think?
I
I got it wrong, see?
I write Liebes.
You can tell the difference. So it's
I-
Liebes?
Yeah, Liebes.
All right, okay, so that's S on the end. Yehuda Liebes. And then let me mention a few more. Goldish, Barna'i. Who else do we want here? No, that's not spelled right.
I. The last one is I.
Right, thank you. And who else do I want to mention? El Kayam doesn't deserve. Pavel, but I can't spell his last name. Macheko.
M-A.
You could do it M-A. He knows how to spell Macheko. This is his friend. He knows how to spell it. Okay, all right, okay. All right, okay, good. All right, that's enough. There are more names, but I'm going to stop with that. Edel and Liebes challenged Shalom on many points, and they're not the same. They're both contemporaries. They both have just recently retired from the Hebrew University. They're both scholars of Kabbalah. I've mentioned, I think, Edel in passing already. Edel challenged the notion of the whole trauma of 1492, you recall, leading to Lurianic Kabbalah. This is the next stage. In other words, Shalom's great narrative is beginning in 1492, then speaking about Lurianic Kabbalah, then speaking about Shabtai Tzvi, and finally, the resolution of this crisis is Hasidism, 18th century Hasidism. It's a wonderful narrative. I mean, I taught it for 25 years, that was the great dramatic story that Shalom told us. But now Edel and Liebes in their own ways have challenged all kinds of the pieces. Specifically, did Lurianic Kabbalah really spread? Was it really the factor that explained and the power and the dynamism of the movement of Shabtai Tzvi, of the Sabbatians afterwards? Aren't there other factors? Do ideas have that much of a power in transforming reality? It's a very intellectual history kind of approach. And being an intellectual historian, I love it. But does it really describe a reality which is social, psychological? What do you do in explaining a social history of Sabbatianism as opposed to a kind of intellectual history? And do Kabbalists really respond to ideas? Or are we not speaking about something that is much deeper? Or not necessarily triggered by historical events? Does a Kabbalist really care about the reality around? If he's a Kabbalist, he lives in his own reality, right? A reality which is not necessarily the same as our reality. So these are really all kinds of questions. And Edel and Liebes, without going into any detail here, have raised all kinds of things. The other interesting aspect of their work, I would call it a kind of postmodern, and I hate to use the phrase post-Zionist, in the sense that their focus on Sabbatianism is not in its national political dimensions, but more in terms of a kind of spiritualizing. Particularly Liebes, speaking about Shabtai Tzvi, was not really aware of his historical reality. Basically, he was concerned more with the spiritualization of Judaism. So their focus is more on non-national political aspects of this movement, and more on psycholization or spiritualization of this movement, which is really quite interesting. Matt Kolish has written a book called The Sabbatean Prophets. He's an American historian at Ohio State. His focus is on two things. One is in seeing the first years of really the end of the 17th century, of seeing this more in terms of connecting it to the kind of psychological tremor going on in Europe in general, both on the part of Christians and part of the Muslims. In other words, he wants this link Jewish messianism to Christian messianism and to Muslim messianism. The first chapter of his book is very evocative in that respect, although he doesn't really make very close links. That's the problem. It's very easy to talk about, yes, there are Muslim groups that are messianic, and there are Christian messianism in the 17th century, but really how do you make these links come alive? And it's really more evocative than it is very, very specific. The other point that he makes is that essentially to move us away from the history of ideas to the history of mass hysteria. In other words, he looks very carefully at when Shabtai Tzvi appeared throughout Europe, and he would excite crowds, and people would go crazy and scream, men, women, children, and so on, that essentially what is going on here is a kind of mass hysterical situation. In other words, to use the language of social psychology to explain Shabtai Tzvi, and to move us away from a history of ideas approach. He also differs with Edel and Liebes on certain points and so on, but that's basically, it seems to be, his contribution. Barna'i, on the one hand, has written a book also called, what's it called in Hebrew, the Shabtai, something on Sabbatianism. He has one original idea, which is an interesting idea, but again, not fully proven. He goes back to the historical argument about the origin of Sabbatianism, which Sholem, what's the name of it?
The Sabbatian movement, social perspective in Hebrew.
Yeah, so what is it? Hatnuah Shabtai? No, it's not. That's something. Or Shabtaim. I don't remember what it is in Hebrew. Okay. And he has an article or two in English too, if you want to sort of find him.
Shabtaut, Hebetim Chevratiyim.
Bediuk, okay, Hebetim Chevratiyim. So his argument is, let's look back at the events that Sholem discounted. Some had argued, for example, that 1648 was a critical date in seeing the emergence of the crisis of Sabbatianism. 1648, you recall, is the Khmelnytsky pogroms in Poland, and it created a tremendous situation where large numbers of exile were forced to leave Poland. Some of them even moved into the south, into the regions of Turkey. Adam Teller now is working on a book in which he's dealing with the refugee crisis that emerged from Khmelnytsky, and they actually end up in Sephardic countries, in countries where there are Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire and so on. He wants to bring us back to 1648, but what the real historical argument that Barna'i is making is that the birthplace of Shabtai Tzvi is Smyrna. And Smyrna is not simply an Ottoman city. It is a city, a port, where many important new Christians, that is conversos, have come to establish a very important trading center in the Mediterranean. And therefore, the link between conversos and Sabbateans, which I will come back to in a second, is very important here. In other words, the initial enthusiasm about Shabtai Tzvi could have come from not Muslim Jews, but from Christian Jews who are living, or who had been Christians. In other words, they saw Shabtai Tzvi in Jesus-like ways. In other words, they were still living with their Christian mentalite, and therefore they brought this to bear in understanding Shabtai Tzvi. Now, it's a very intriguing idea, but again, how do you prove something like this? And the proof is rather circumstantial, other than the fact that Smyrna was indeed a major place where Christians were living, or former Christians who had returned to Judaism, conversos. Finally, Pavel Mancheko. Pavel has written the most authoritative book we have on the history of Frank and Frankism. I could also mention, there's a book by Max, what's his last name? You know him, from the guy that writes on Don He was in Germany, but he's now in California.
There.
Max Baer.
Right.
Yeah, Max Baer has a recent book on the Don that is the group that converted Jews who converted to Islam. But Pavel has written a brilliant book on Jacob Frank and Frankism. It follows an earlier work by Balaban, one of the great historians of the 1930s, and what Sholem has written on Frankism as well. But it really is remarkable in that he gets into the archives in Poland and elsewhere, and he places Frank within the context of a larger cultural matrix. And I'll come back to that because one of the points that he makes in this book is it has to do with mingled identities, and is a very important point. I think his work helps confirm my own inclination of how important mingled identities is in this whole story. So these are some of the historians. I'm sorry I gave you so many names, but obviously if you're going to get into this topic, you've got to do a lot of reading. And these are some of the people. So Sholem is important, and the rest are all responding and refining and criticizing and so on and so forth. All right, so now I want to come to, I could have mentioned also Abraham El-Khayyam has written his dissertation. He never published it, an 800-page dissertation on Natan Ha'azati, on Nathan of Gaza. So I have a copy of it. I can't say I've read it word for word, but he never published anything. But he's a very smart guy. All right, so now what I want to do is move our discussion. The only other thing I could mention is that there has been considerable work done on Christian responses to Shabtai Tzvi. So this is not an isolated phenomenon. I just want to refer you to one article which I think is really relevant. It's a wonderful essay. In the book that we published at the Center on Christian Hebraicism, which I did edited by Alison Coder and Jeffrey Schultzen. I forgot the title of it, but I did mention it in the past. There is a wonderful essay by an historian at Jerusalem named Michael Haid, H-E-Y-D. Haid's work is important not only for this article, but for an earlier book that he wrote on enthusiasm and anti-enthusiasm in early modern Europe. I'm going to come back to that book in a second. Haid's article is on Shabtai Tzvi, the Messiah, in Christian sources. And that's really interesting, to see how Christians are aware, are responding, use it as a polemical thrust against Judaism. Look at these crazy Jews, they're following Shabtai Tzvi, look, they're nuts. But he has incredible sources, and it's a really very fine article if you want to see the interaction or Christian responses to Shabtai Tzvi. All right, but here's what I want to do, and I have to mention one more name because I'm going to build on her, but I want to go farther than she's gone. And her name is Karlibach. Elisheva Karlbach. Karlbach wrote a work on one important character in our story. His name is Moshe Hadjiz. Originally born in Spain?
No.
Portugal? Where? Morocco? Where? Morocco, right, okay, Morocco. But clearly a Sephardi Jew who travels all over the place is one among several, let's call them heresy hunters. That is, people who are antagonistic towards Shabtai Tzvi, towards the movement, and become essentially defenders of the faith, and see their whole mission in life to attack Shabtai Tzvi and his followers. Hadjiz, therefore, becomes the focus of her narrative, but using Hadjiz's life, she interprets events evolving regarding Sabbatianism from the beginning of the 18th century until the middle of the century. So now I want to shift gears. We've been talking up to now with this historiography primarily about the 17th century. I want to now speak about the first half of the 18th century, because that's where I think the crisis emerges. Okay? and that's why it doesn't necessarily fit with Hazard or with Jonathan Israel and so on. It's related, but it's later. In other words, one way of telling the story, which is Edel's way, is what happened in 1666 and what happened in 1670, and how are these two events related? What? No, what happened? 1666, of course, Shabbat Tzvi, right?
Yeah.
1670 is publication of the political theological treatise of Spinoza. Okay? Between 4 years this happens, all right? So how are they related? That's the question. But let's leave that question aside for the moment. So now I want to talk about the 18th century. What happens in the 18th century is, in the name of Shabtai Tzvi, a series of debates, convulsions, attacks, public disputations break out within the Jewish community, which shatter the unity of the Jewish community and create both the followers and the opponents, put them in a situation of violent clashes. Elisheva describes three. I want to talk about those three, and I want to elaborate just a little bit more. I got to just watch my time. Wait, so we have till 12:30 for this first hour. Okay, good. All right, so there are three crises, and in some respects they are larger than the initial crisis of Shabtai Tzvi in the first place. Shabtai Tzvi is long gone, he's dead, but somehow Shabtaut, or Sabbatianism, lingers on. Okay, it continues on into the 18th century. In 1703, a controversy breaks out in Amsterdam, but several other places, soon across Europe. Regarding a character named Nehemiah Chayon, or Chayun. So the Chayun controversy is number one. The second controversy is Emden Eibeshitz, and I mentioned his name several times, but I don't know how to spell it. Eibeshitz, something like that? No? No, it's...
Why?
Okay, Eibeshitz. Well, there are several ways to spell it, but anyway, that's close enough. And then the third controversy is Ramchal, Rabbi Moses Chaim Lutzato. Okay. These all take place in the first half of the 18th century. In 1703, Chayun publishes a work called Oz LeElohim, Strength to God. It is a work in which he describes how he can tell us the secret of knowing God and how you can identify God. It is very much Kabbalistic. He explains, however, God in a Kabbalistic fashion to describe him as being triune, that is, three essences. And while he is talking about three different sfirot, in other words, it's not meant to be, keep stepping, I pulled out a plug here, I hope it doesn't matter. It's not meant to be Christian. The Christians immediately associated, wow, he's talking about the Trinity. The book is immediately problematic. Now, he's called a Sabbatean. Why is he called a Sabbatean? That's a good question. I mean, he's not, what is he doing that's Sabbatean? Is he evoking Shabtai Tzvi's name? No. Nothing to do with it. But nevertheless, this is part of a Sabbatean crisis. What happens, which is really quite amazing, over this book, Hajiz is involved, but there are a whole group of other rabbis. He organizes a campaign against this book. He goes and he confronts the Ma'amad in Amsterdam, not allowing Chayun to come to Amsterdam. He then organizes a campaign of hundreds of rabbis writing all over Europe, and from Eastern Europe all the way to the Bad Arbat Sot in Eastern Europe, the Italian rabbis, the German rabbis, the rabbis in the Middle East. He organizes a major campaign to destroy this book. Clearly the Christian overtones are there. Pavel Macheko has published an essay in which he talks about how this book was picked up by a group of Christian missionaries who saw Chayon as a potential landsman, a potential, what's the Spanish word for landsman? A potential colleague of theirs, in the sense that he's talking a Christian. In other words, the Christians were very interested in this book as well, which made things even worse. So a major controversy. There are hundreds of responses. It's really quite amazing. Many of these letters have been published, by the way, by a group of scholars. We have all of this material which describes the Chayun affair. Okay? So that's affair number one. Affair number two. I want to go as quickly as I can. Jacob Emden, I mentioned Hajiz. I want to mention three names of heresy hunters. These were the major individuals to play a role in trying to destroy the Sabbatian movement. The first was Hajiz, the second was Sasportas, and the third is Emden. These were all rabbis. Sasportas and Hajiz were Sephardic. Emden is Ashkenazic, is the rabbi of Altona, Hamburg. Emden is an incredible personality of the 18th century. We have a dissertation by him, but there's so much more to be written. One of the most interesting aspects of him is that he had his own printing press, and that he put out 150 books by himself in his house. And that's how he disseminated his knowledge. And he was really into print. I mean, this is a guy that was really shaped by print and by print culture and so on. His ultimate goal is to destroy Sabbatianism, and he finds heresies in every corner, including the rabbi who is competing for his loyalty, Jonathan Eibeshitz. Now, Eibeshitz isn't a run-of-the-man. I mean, he's not, Chayon is a kind of suspect character. But Eibeshitz is a major halachic figure in the 18th century. He's just as important as Emden. Emden, and both of them are different or crazy in their own way. Emden is definitely crazy. If you don't believe me, read his autobiography, which he wrote. He wrote an autobiography called Megillat Sefer, which describes his wet dreams and his going to the bathroom and all kinds of strange things. I mean, it's really a weird book. Who's the guy that wrote on Emden? J.J. Schechter. J.J. Schechter wrote his dissertation for Isidore Tversky on Emden, and he promised that he would publish this book in English. But he's an Orthodox rabbi, and I guess he's scared to publish it's never been published. I think there's now maybe somebody put out an English translation of Megillat Sefer. But the book there is an edition in Hebrew if you want to read it. So Emden is crazy, but Emden is also brilliant, and Emden is writing on everything. Most recently, a young scholar in Jerusalem named Maoz Kahan has been writing some brilliant essays on Emden, particularly his knowledge of alchemy and medicine and so on. These rabbis are not isolated. They're very much connected with the larger world. And both Emden and Eibeshitz, by the way, have a very open view of Christianity. Those of you that heard my lecture on Sefer HaBrit, Emden and Eibeshitz have very open and tolerant views of Christianity. At the same time, they're fighting each other and so on. Anyway, Emden goes after Eibeshitz and says, "You are a Sabbatian." That's the debate. And for 30 years, they're arguing back and forth and so on. He accuses Eibeshitz of making an amulet. On one side is the Magen David, and the other side is a cross. The Star of David and a cross. And therefore, he is a Christian. Notice what's going on here. Mingle identities. Eibeshitz somehow is becoming, is taking on certain interests in Christianity, or opening himself up to Christianity. Now, could that be, and does that make him a Sabbatian? And what does this have to do with Shabtai Tzvi? I asked you the question about Chayon. What does this have to do with Shabtai Tzvi? Are they talking Shabtai Tzvi here? No, they're talking about Sabbatianism in a kind of generic way, which is heresy, which is mingle identities, is what I'm trying to say. How do I know mingle identities? Because the son of Jonathan Eibeshitz, Wolf Eibeshitz, becomes a Christian. So there's stuff going on here, right? And some of the other disciples of Eibeshitz became involved in Christianity. Years ago, Yehuda Liebes published an article which he argued incorrectly, but nevertheless he had the right inclination, that there was a Judeo-Christian sect that emerged around this time, and Eibeshitz was part of it, secretly. So on the one hand, he's an Orthodox rabbi, he's writing halacha, he is participating, and he's competing over a position which Emden wanted. That's why Emden attacks him. So there's a personal controversy here, but there's also much going on. Most scholars today claim that Eibeshitz indeed had certain heretical tendencies, but they were secret. The most amazing thing was when I went, my first trip to Germany was in 2000, and I decided I would go just to one place. I was having trouble as a Jew dealing with Germany, but I wanted to go to Germany. So after a conference I had attended, I went to Hamburg, and there I've already told this story to Katya. I visited with a colleague who showed me the Sephardic cemetery. But he said to me at the end of the visit, he says, well, don't you want to see the Ashkenazim as well? So we walked over to the Ashkenazi part of the cemetery. It's an enormous cemetery in the Reeperbahn. Have you ever been to the Reeperbahn in Hamburg? Really? Nobody ever been there? Well, it's good because it's all about sex. It's a sex area. You have to walk through to get to the cemetery. I didn't do it on purpose. You know, I was on my way to the cemetery. Anyway, you walk to the Ashkenaz Seminary, so who's buried there? Emden and Eibeshitz. And the most amazing thing is that there is a grave in between them, but it's like they're buried next to each other and they're talking to each other. They made their peace in the grave. You know, it's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. Here's Eibeshitz and here's Emden, and they're all quiet. You know, and they've all made their peace. But this was one of the great controversies of the 18th century. All right, the last one is really interesting, and this guy is becoming a big hero in modern Jewish scholarship. Ramchal. Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto, born of converso background, becomes a very important rabbi and prophetic figure in Padova, in Italy. Has a group around him who celebrate him as a kind of prophet. He has seances, he has secret discussions with God, he understands the world in a prophetic way. He is really a super mystic. But he's a much more complicated character than that. He writes Baroque drama. And for some of the first historians of modern Hebrew literature, he is the beginning of modern Hebrew literature, of all things. I mean, he's writing Hebrew drama. He writes Hebrew poetry. He's multifaceted. He was condemned by the rabbis for being a Sabbatean, a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. Again, what's the connection with Shabtai Tzvi? What he was doing was speaking with God, and knowing God, understanding God. In other words, notice the parallel of Chayon there. He was involved in a kind of prophetic. He was a prophetic figure in Padua at the same time. But the most amazing thing is that despite all of this condemnation and the attacks against him, which is the third controversy here, his whole image has been rehabilitated. In modern Jewish culture, if you go to Mea Sharim today, you can purchase Kol Kitvei Ramchal very easily. All of the writings of Ramchal. Everybody reads Ramchal. Ramchal was a very popular person, primarily because of one little book that he wrote called Mesilat Yesharim, which is a moral book. It's a book about Musar. And it clearly had a great influence, was really one of the most important moral kind of guides written during this period of time. Ramchal is now the subject of a new biography that is emerging by Jonathan Garb at the Hebrew University. And he has placed him within the context of Italian thought in general, including a very important Italian figure, Vico, and made all kinds of interesting connections. Ramchal is really very much in these days in terms of understanding the origins of the Haskalah, coming out of this Kabbalistic background. So despite the Sabbatean part of it, nevertheless, there's a lot of interest in him and his work. All right, so now let me put this all together for you as we wind down in this first hour. What I want to suggest, and here I want to use Michael Haid's enthusiasm and anti-enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is a very 18th century word. What is an enthusiast? a person who knows the truth through his own human autonomy, whether it is being a prophet or being an intellectual, knowing God, that is, knowing the truth, knowing the understanding of the universe. He doesn't have to rely upon institutions, nor upon ideologies, nor upon religious leaders. He works outside the framework of those institutions to create, to understand himself and his world and the secrets that he comes up with. This would fit Chayon, Eibeshitz, and Ramchal, and I would argue this even fits Spinoza. In other words, an enthusiast is a person that through his own human autonomy knows the truth. Enthusiasts are threatening to establishments, religious establishments primarily, but also political establishments, medical establishments. In other words, by arguing that enthusiasts are meshugana, are crazy, you essentially push them off the scene. So part of the discourse about melancholy, for example, in the 18th century, which is indeed a discussion, is a medical discussion. And here the doctor is defining who is crazy and who's not crazy. Jacob Frank is crazy. Ramchal is crazy. In other words, if you put him in this context and so on. So what I would like to suggest is the following, that Sabbatianism by the 18th century has no relationship to Shabtai Tzvi whatsoever, but it is a general term which has to do with enthusiasm, and is a general kind of threat to the rabbinic establishment. And the rabbis perceived this as being a threat, and while they were threatened in other ways by the loss of their power through laicization, we saw in terms of the Jewish community, they saw themselves losing power and authority because of the printed book. They saw that their own power and authority was eclipsed by constant mobility and changes of the Jewish community and the reconfiguration of leadership. Now comes a real crisis which they are aware of. And I define it, why is it a crisis? Because they are aware of the crisis. They talk about it. They have to galvanize their energies to fight this crisis. There's a wonderful book by Sholem Rosenberg, who is where's he, from South America, right? Uruguay, right. He wrote an essay many years ago that appeared in Hebrew and an English book edited by Isidore Tversky on the 17th century called Emunat Chachamim. Emunat Chachamim means in English the faith of the rabbis, the faith of the Chachamim, of the wise rabbis. The question is, does Emunat Chachamim, is it Emunat Chachamim or is it Emunat Bechachamim? And he argues it's the latter. Do you understand the difference? Emunat, a belief in the sages, in other words, in their authority. What he does is show, and many of these books, by the way, are in Spanish. He shows an enormous list of books written in this period of time, the 18th century, the end of the 17th and 18th century, which are written by rabbis defending rabbinic authority and rabbinic faith. He sees this as part of a crisis as well. Now his interpretation is a little bit weird, so I'm not going to go into it, and it's been discussed later on by Yosef Kaplan, who wrote a response to him, and so on and so forth. But the genre of this literature is very interesting, and I want to go back again to the three major characters, and here's where I want to give you one more spin in our story. They perceive these rabbis as a threat to their authority, and they organize themselves both politically and also in terms of print. In other words, one of the ways we can talk about the Sabbatian movement being an early modern phenomenon is that it galvanizes the printing press in the most serious way. We have pamphlets, both for and against, Shabtai Tzvi, Sabbatians, and so on. The Nehemiah Chayon affair, for example, is an extraordinary event in terms of small little publications, pamphlet wars is what we're talking about here. Now what I want to argue is that the rabbis perceive this as heterodoxy. They perceive these people as impure. They perceive, and here they're speaking about Sabbatians, but they're not speaking about Shabtai Tzvi. They're speaking in general about all the enemies to the rabbinic establishment. And they need to organize themselves. And what I want to suggest is that their organization, their counter-offensive, is the beginnings of orthodoxy. If you have heterodoxy, you have orthodoxy. Orthodox define heterodox, right? Orthodox are the ones that say you are impure. Now, this is a big discussion which I'm not going to get into now, but orthodoxy in traditional Jewish historiography is defined primarily as a 19th century event, and the person that wrote the first and the most on this, and most of his disciples followed him, was Jacob Katz, who we've mentioned already several times. By the way, notice his book is called Tradition in Crisis, but he never ever mentioned any crisis in other words, there's nothing early modern about his crisis is Sabbatean, he following Gershon Sholem, but nevertheless, he doesn't relate to the question that I began my lecture with, namely, what does this have to do with the general crisis? All right, but let me come back to this point. So what I'm saying is that these three rabbis, Hajiz, Asportas, Emden, were part of an organized campaign on the part of the Rabbinic, which affected all of Europe, both East and West and South, in a campaign against the Sabbatians, which continues for a long time, way into the 18th century. Jacob Frank and his followers convert to Christianity in the 1750s, 60s. Yeah. So what we're speaking about is something that goes on for 100 years and has several manifestations, several forms. But we're speaking again about a crisis. Frank is right in the middle of the 18th century as well. So what we're speaking about, therefore, is heterodoxy and orthodoxy. We're speaking about a group of rabbis that organize themselves, that separate themselves from those who are breaking away from who see this as a threat. The public revelation of God's name is, of course, a misuse of the printing press. And clearly, this Ramchal guy is a very, very dangerous character running around speaking with God and telling us about it and so on and so forth. So these manifestations, so Sabbatian, and therefore comes a term for describing a whole crisis. Then I could put, overlapping that, Spinoza. But Spinoza doesn't really play any major role within Jewish life, although Spinoza is also related to the phenomenon. The way Spinoza might be related is, you recall, the extraordinary involvement of conversos in the Sabbatian movement. In other words, and I'm going to link that up again when I talk about mingled identities in the next hour. But clearly the conversos really became involved with Shabtai Tzvi. In every major community where conversos were living, Amsterdam, Hamburg, Smyrna, there were large cells of Sabbatian followers. So indeed, there is a relationship between converso identity, between these Jews who had lived as Christians, now returned to Judaism, and their appreciation of the messiahship of Shabtai Tzvi. In that sense, since Spinoza came from a converso background, we could link this to a larger story that is going on here. So here's my argument then, as it's now 12:30, it's perfect timing. That essentially, my understanding of the Sabbatian crisis, I've sort of pushed into the 18th century, where I think the wars really break out and explode, and that ultimately Sabbatianism is not about Shabtai Tzvi or about the Messiah or even about antinomianism. This will be my segue into the second hour. Antinomianism, you recall, is anti-law. Again, we're breaking the law. That was, for Sholem, the primary sin of the Sabbatians. For Pavel Mancheko, the primary sin of the Sabbatians, and particularly the Frankists, Jacob Frank, the messianic figure also, who sees himself as a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, is mingled identities. Is the fact that to become a good Jew means to become a Christian or a Muslim, too, simultaneously. How do you do that? Okay? In other words, boundary crossings, breaking from one religion into another, and so on. That's the problem, and we'll talk more about this in the second hour, and so on. And therefore, Sabbatianism is just a code word for essentially a challenge on the part of individuals from a variety of backgrounds with the rabbinic establishment, and the rabbis perceive this to be as a threat. And you could argue in the 19th century, when the rabbis take on Reform Judaism and so on and so forth, that's a bigger threat and that's a bigger orthodoxy and so on. There's a whole literature on the question of what is orthodoxy versus heterodoxy and so on, both in general historiography and also in Jewish historiography. And that's in the book if you're interested. I'll give you plenty of things to read there. But I still think that what we're talking about here is the Sabbatians. To define them as heterodox, you need a group of orthodox. In other words, they go together. In other words, you need those who define what are the limits of being Jewish, what are our definition of Jewish. And these definitions are obviously defined in the context of those who break them, and thus the separation between the impure and the pure. So that, to me, makes sense in describing the 18th century. Okay? Any questions or comments? Go on.
So what you contend essentially is that this is a question of crisis of authority, political, political authority. And in that sense I see, that view of Sabbatarianism is very similar to the crisis with 15th century Averroism that has been exposed.
In Spain.
Averroism is a code name also for something, for a crisis of authority, of rabbinical authority in the Spanish community.
Yes, absolutely.
But it has nothing to do with Averroism.
Exactly,
Averroism.
Great parallel.
So I think that this is just the same thing. So just to point, I don't know if there would be a continuation of the lines,
Right.
what is happening in the 16th century in the middle.
Right.
So this is the first observation. The second one has to do with the Sephardic Ashkenazi divide lines, because nothing to do, of course, with a question of ethnic differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, but in all these three cases, it's always happens in places where Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews come together and just, I don't know if
there's a
this
clash.
is a clash between them. And thinking of Enden, the interesting thing for me concerning Enden is that he was very much acquainted with Sephardic Jews because
Yes.
his father was he studied in Salonika and was the rabbi in Sarajevo. Before coming to, he was
Right, Chacham
Moravia.
Tzvi, yeah, exactly.
He was a rabbi. He was the first rabbi, the
Right.
first Ashkenazi rabbi in Sarajevo.
Right, so he had a lot of contact with Spartan.
And with Sabbatean Jews,
Yes,
because of the impact
Yes.
in Bosnia and
Yes.
Serbia of
Yes.
Sabbateanism in the
Right.
18th century.
right. All right, those are two very interesting observations. The first, I like the notion of Averroism as a kind of code word also for something that's broader and so on. Can I link that to the later controversy and so on? I'm not sure I can, but clearly the common equation is a threat to a rabbinic authority. So in that sense, you have a situation which is similar. Again, it's an issue of scale. We're getting back to it because, the kind of literature, the printing press, the power, the movement of this throughout the entire European region. That's what's extraordinary about the Chayon affair, is that there are letters from rabbis all over the continent. It's an enormous phenomenon that we're describing here. Now, it's true that this was organized by Hajis and others, but nevertheless, the fact that it sort of breaks down all the ethnic subdivisions and becomes something so large and vast, my argument is that it is indeed an early modern phenomenon. But I have to think about the issue of Averroism. So Averroism was primarily a critique against the rationalists who were undermining Judaism. In other words, it was very much focused on philosophy, but also on lifestyle, correct? It was about the courtier class, the social, and so on and so forth. But clearly it's a very interesting parallel that needs to be considered. I think the Sabbatian crisis is a larger one because of the reasons I indicate, but how they're connected,
Goodberg published an article specifically on putting the basis for considering Averroism as a question of criticism of the rabbinical class in 15th century. So then there's an incredible parallel there.
Are they connected ultimately? I don't know. One after the other. I mean, remember, Shabtai Tzvi appears as a kind of mystical enthusiast, and the other is couched more in terms of rational terms. But ultimately, as I point out, they're the same. They're the same threat to the rabbinic authority. So anyway, that's a very good point. On the second point, I think mobility and social mixing creates tensions, and I could accept in part a partial explanation of this controversy and all the controversies of early modern Europe within the context of these sub-communities meeting, clashing, and finding it hard to that's part of what I argued from the beginning, that the early modern is about one Jew getting to know another Jew. And sometimes it works, sometimes you hate that Jew, it happens to me all the time. And clearly we're here. I mean, it looks on the surface that Sabbatianism kind of sort of breaks the barriers down between because we have Ashkenazim and Sephardim and so on. But we have to be very careful here. I mean, Frank, for example, is dealing primarily with Ashkenazic Jews, and the Don Meir are dealing primarily with Sephardic Jews. But nevertheless, there are all kinds of interesting overlaps. I think you have something here. I mean, I think that part of an appreciation. And Hajiz and Sasbordas, of course, are very Sephardic, and they see the world, in very clear black and white terms. So maybe I have to make a footnote saying that the rabbis are threatened, but they're also threatened, that the ethnic dimension also is a part of the story here. And the difficulty of Ashkenaz. I mean, the Ashkenazim and Sephardim are fighting throughout this entire period. In Italy, certainly in Israel itself, in Palestine, Jerusalem, Ashkenazim, Sephardim are still finding it hard to sort of live with each other and so on. And they still do. I mean, it goes on until 21st century. Anyway, good comments. Go on. Yeah.
I wanted to make a link to other movements that are happening in Europe at the time, because when you mention enthusiasm, what I think of is Kant and Swedenborg, right? Because precisely what Kant accuses Swedenborg of is enthusiasm. That's Swedenborg's crime in Kant's eyes, which is later in the 18th century.
Yeah.
Right, but this is enthusiasmus. This is the great heresy in Kantian philosophy, and he builds his philosophy arguably around sort of it not being enthusiasm. But so I'm just curious about the relationship as you see it between what happens later.
My second hour, actually, we mentioned him in the past because.
Right, and also because you mentioned in
I want to speak about Jacob. What's his name? Johann Kemper.
Yeah.
Who was the teacher of Swedenborg and who was a
Right.
follower of Shabtai Tzvi. So it is
another
all connected.
In the other talk you mentioned the Swedenborg Sabbatian connections. I want to know more about that.
I know Swedenborg is a very good example of this, and particularly the relationship between Swedenborgianism, Freemasonry, this came up in my lecture, and Sabbatianism. They're all and Frankism. They're all very much connected, as Pavel now is showing us in all kinds of interesting ways. These people are really talking with each other. They're really sharing with each other. The Michael Haid article is just the beginning of a whole interaction between Jews and Christians on this very messianic spiritual level. I spent some time after I got involved with the Freemasons. I went to visit the Swedenborgian Society in London, so I was reading all of their literature and so on, reading Swedenborg and so on. More has to be done. Elliot Wolfson has an article or two where he talks about Kabbalah and Swedenborg and so on. But clearly, Kempfer, the guy I'll speak about in the second hour, is a direct link, and I'm sure there are others. Oh yeah, there's another one that I wrote about. Schnabber Levinson. He's one of the characters in my book called Jewish Enlightenment in English Key. And he goes off, he's invited to Sweden, and he meets Swedenborg, and he creates an alchemical laboratory there. So it was really weird stuff. And he leaves England, he comes from Germany to England, to Sweden, goes back to England, and finally goes back to Germany. He's a doctor, he's a very important doctor. But he's described in my book, and that story is another fact. So there are all kinds of connections here. Some of them that maybe you'll make in your future research. All right, take a short break. We still got a lot more to cover, and this is the end, so don't take too long. let's start again. So, I guess Josh is still out of the room, but let me start without him. So what I want to do in our last 45 minutes or so is, or 40 minutes, or, yeah, 40 minutes, is to talk about my notion of mingled identities. The word, if you prefer, it's too postmodern for me. We talk about hybridities. That word is overused, so I like Natalie Zeman Davis's term, braided identities. You sort of, the braids are all separate, but then they are all connected together, braids, Yeah. Here I want to suggest, as the final factor, and this is really related to, in other words, the rabbis perceive this to be the crisis. This is the crisis, the major crisis. There are a lot of crises. It's not just their authority is being undermined. It is that what is emerging by the 18th century is Jews who define themselves by choice as Jews. It's a very contemporary notion. I mean, we live in a world today where, I wouldn't say the majority of Jews, but I would say large numbers of Jews, certainly in the United States, but certainly in Europe, come from mixed backgrounds, mother Christian, father Jew, or vice versa, and so on and so forth. And the emergence of already a kind of mingle identities where they are sharing their identity, multiple identities, and that we don't just have one clear identity. And the Jewish community is looking, or if we look at it from the perspective of today, as there are, the purists, and then everybody else who is, and the overwhelming majority who are Jewish in a very different way. What I'm trying to say is that by the 18th century, certain numbers of Jews are defining themselves Jewish, but by their own definition of what Jewishness is, not by the definition of the church, nor the synagogue, nor the rabbis. They are defining themselves as they understand themselves. In other words, their own autonomy to determine, I am Jewish because I call myself Jewish. Now that's a very modern phenomenon, which we usually associate with the modern period. But I want to suggest that it already emerges in this period of time. And I want to speak about 4 groups. And this is the way I actually did the Madrid talk. I don't think you remember from that time. But, all right, I'm glad you forgot, because I don't remember repeating from him. So I want to speak about 4 groups, and I think they're all interrelated. The first group are the conversos, which are the most obvious. So here we're speaking about those who return from Catholicism to Judaism, reclaiming their birthright, to use the language of the more romantic historians, Chaim Beinard and Yitzhak Beer, and all of the people that saw this as a kind of romantic phenomenon. But clearly these are, to use another modern phrase, Jews by choice. We usually talk about converts as being Jews by choice. They choose to be Jewish. They come to Amsterdam, and some of them choose to be Jewish and choose to be super Jews, to be meticulous with their observance of the commandments, and are very concerned with those who do not observe Judaism, see themselves on a mission to bring back the others who are not Jewish into a very Orthodox Jewish fold, or a traditional Jewish fold. Then there are those who convert, but essentially continue to live very secular lives. And then there are those who are indifferent to any religion. And then there are those conversos who retain their Christian identity. And then there are those who want to be Sabbateans. In other words, we have a whole range of possibilities here. There's no one definition of how a converso will play out his Jewish life. Some of them will live within the context of Jewishness and Christianity, and for many of them, Jewishness is an ethnic, cultural category, not a religious category. In other words, to be a member of how do you pronounce it, the Nation? Nation is not necessarily a religious definition at all. It is it is a racial definition. Those Ashkenazic Jews are not members of the Nation. We are superior. We Sephardim. This again reinforces the clash between Sephardim and Ashkenazim in early modern Europe. So these clearly are what we would call Jews. They are also very mobile. They're moving from community to community. And of course, if we want to bring in David Graysbard's book and Mercedes' book on Abraham Palash, these are individuals who quite often switch identities because it makes good business sense. You know, they go from community to community. In North Africa, they are Muslim. In Spain, they are Catholic. In Amsterdam, they are Jewish. Jewish identities can be switched. They're very flexible. So here we're speaking about a very interesting phenomenon. Is it only a Western phenomenon? To a great extent, it is. We're talking about the Sephardic diaspora, right? But remember, Sephardim get to Germany. They get to Hamburg. They also, many of them even go, certainly they go to the Ottoman Empire, and even some make their way into Eastern Europe. So we are, certainly to Prague, there is a Sephardic synagogue. So what we are speaking about then is a community that is wide-ranging, who are essentially very much, I don't want to call them prefigurations or adumbrations of modern Jews, but the notion of Jews by choice, of choosing what elements within my identity to accept and which not to, or to live with the possibility of being both Jewish and Christian together, which for many of them, in southern France, for example, many of these conversos didn't come out. They didn't declare themselves fully Jews. They still retained their Christian identity on the surface. They were clearly a group between Judaism and Christianity. So clearly the notion of mingled status does make a great deal of sense. But now I want to superimpose upon them a second group. And this group, of course, are the Sabbatians that we spoke about before. We're speaking about a new kind of syncretism. In the name of the Messiah, Jews need to convert to Islam or to Christianity. Jewish Messianism is restructured to embrace its sister rival religions. The Messiah comes not only to overturn existing rabbinic authority, but to reconfigure Judaism in such a way as to reintegrate it with Christianity and with Islam. A radical syncretism based on antinomian and nihilistic tendencies, proclaiming the abolishment of traditional religious boundaries. But the key emphasis I want to make here is not the antinomianism, but the mixed identities, the hybrid identities. Okay? And when Sabbatians and conversos come together as they do, then we really have a mixed bag, right? We really have mixing all over the place, right? Jews thinking like Christians and so on. Take, for example, and you just pointed out to me, mistake in my book, Abraham Cardoza is a perfect example of this. One of the great dialogues in early modern history was reconstructed by Yosef Yerushalmi in his book on Yitzhak Cardoza. The dialogue between him and his brother. Yitzhak Cardoza makes his way from Alcala,
Sí, Alcalá.
right,
Yeah.
to and he ends up in the ghetto of Verona, and there he becomes this good, great Jew. He returns to Judaism. A wonderful story of a converso, which Yerushalmi has put together in a brilliant way. But he has a brother, and the brother has a different path. He becomes a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. And one of the first, in the first generation of ideologues of Sabbatianism, becomes, clearly has something to do with shaping the whole ideology of Shabtai Tzvi in its first years. So Isaac and Abraham get into this conversation, which Yerushalmi beautifully reconstructs in his book, From Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto, in which Yitzchak says to Abraham, "But what you believe in about Shabtai Tzvi, it's total Christianity. It's like believing in Jesus. You're making the Messiah into a God. That's not Judaism. That's..." and Abraham basically says, Christians have a good idea. Why can't we accept it? So he acknowledges his mingle identity quite openly and explicitly. It's an incredible exchange where, Isaac goes after him for specifically, we have boundaries. This is Judaism, this is Christianity. And Abraham is saying, no, if the Christians have a good idea, I want to see Shabtai Tzvi through my Christian background. See him as a Jesus kind of figure. So here we have a very interesting connection between conversoism and Sabbatianism. So Sabbatianism, therefore, and we're talking about a long history here. First, the Donmeh, a group of individuals who are living as a secret sect within the Ottoman world, who are practicing Judaism and Islam simultaneously. I heard when I was in Budapest this brilliant lecture by a graduate student of Pavel's, Adar Feldman, in which she presented 150 poems written by Donmeh, which are written in Turkish, Ladino, Hebrew. What else do we have? Absolutely amazing. And the language is so hybrid, but the concepts also. These people are drawing from several different cultural traditions and creating a new tradition, a mingled identity of the first order. So these poems are wild. They're really all over the place. Or the other example that I've given in the past is, in that back to that Hamburg cemetery in the Ripperbahn in Hamburg, the crosses and the Stars of David on the graves, the biblical scenes which are painted in a very Christian way, and so on. This is really all over the place. And then, of course, Jacob Frank converts to Christianity in Warsaw with 1,000 of his followers. But soon after, he's excommunicated by the church, because he's arguing, my Christianity is pure, your Catholic Church is a bunch of garbage, right? We're the true Christians. And of course, his Christianity is a mingled identity between Jews and Christians and so on. So his critique is not only against Judaism, it's against Christianity as well. And he creates his own line of thinking, which is Frankism, whatever that is. A Frankish version of Christianity and of Judaism. So this is the ultimate fulfillment of the Messiah, right? To become a Jew Christian in a Frankist way. Frank also published a book called The Words of the Master in Polish, which has been translated into English. It's online. I don't know how good a translation it is, but it is there. And it is a totalitarian-minded work here. Follow the Master step by step. Destroy the rabbis. Pour blood into the streets. It's a very violent kind of language in which he describes his way to religiosity, to spirituality, and so on. So here again, the mingled dimension, the boundary crossings is what upsets the rabbis too. You can't be Jewish and Christian at the same time. It's interesting, because when you talk about this, at least in an American context, you think about, Barbra Streisand, not Barbra Streisand, you think about Madonna and Kabbalah. How can you be a Kabbalist and be a Christian? But you can, right? And there's a long history of this, right? We talked about Christian Hebraism last week, but now we're talking about this kind of syncretism going on. Rabbis may protest, Jews for Jesus, but there's a long history here, right, of Jews for Jesus. that played itself out not only in this period but in an ancient period as well. All right, and now I want to introduce two other groups in this mix, and we'll sort of put this then all together. So the third group that I want to speak about are converts, individual converts to Christianity. And we already have the beginning of a serious scholarly literature on these individuals. But the most important book in recent days is, again, Elisheva Karlbach, her book on Christian converts to, Jewish converts to Christianity in early modern Germany. And now we have the work of Deutsch, what's his first name? Yaakov Deutsch, right? His book has come out from Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken, or Oxford or Cambridge, which is essentially a study of works written by converts, he uses them as kind of ethnographies of their movement from Judaism to Christianity. We have many of these, and they are, so the Karlbach book, the Deutsch book, Maria Demling is another one. There are several people that have been working on these characters and so on. We also have a considerable amount of material available to us from England, where Jews are converting throughout this entire period of time. In that context, I should mention my book, which I can't remember the title of it. What the hell's the name of my book? It's about, I'm going to be talking about this in a second, Moses Marcus, a convert who happens to be the grandson of a very famous woman named Glickl of Hamelin. Glickl was as famous, we talked about her autobiography last time very quickly, but she doesn't mention an autobiography that of the, I think, 8 grandchildren or 12 grandchildren she had, one of them converted to Christianity, and his name was Moses Marcus. I picked this up in a footnote in Karlbach's book and decided to write a whole book on Moses Marcus and to use him as a vehicle for understanding the 18th century in England. And it's called, it's after the title of a Christian Hebraist book. I can't remember the name of my book. Man, I'm really lost it. Anyway, Connecting the Covenants. That's what it's about. And the reason why I use that title is because a very famous Christian Hebraist at the time, named Humphrey, wrote a book specifically on connecting the covenants, in which he wanted to link Christianity and Judaism. So the story of Marcus is a guy that goes off. His father is the richest Jew in England. His father is a big diamond merchant that spends all of his time in India, in Calicut and places doing diamonds. Ignores his son, but sends him to Hamburg to study in the yeshiva there. And there he meets a group of missionaries, and he's converted to Christianity, comes back, and not the Archbishop of Canterbury, I mean the chief Protestant honcho of England, is involved with his conversion, and then writes a book in the same genre, The Reasons Why I Gave Up Judaism to Become a Christian. And the story is really quite fascinating because the father is incensed. According to the son, they threaten him with a knife. They steal him and take him to Amsterdam, where he essentially, what do you call it, decompressed. What's the word where they take, the cults, they try to decult them? You know what I'm talking about, Josh?
Decult them?
No, what's the word? I mean, essentially
unbrainwash?
To unbrainwash them, right? To remove their indoctrination.
Yeah.
So he's held in, and then he writes a letter to his father and mother saying, "Dear Abba and Ima, don't worry, I'm not serious. I'm still a good Jewish boy." But at the same time, he's totally involved with the church. So, beautiful example of mingled identities. But he's only one of many in England at the same time. And then he becomes, what do you do when you become a Christian? How do you earn a living? I mean, there was really an economic issue here involved. How can Christianity absorb all of these poor Jews? Many of them who convert are doing it for social reasons, for economic reasons. Well, for some of them, they become experts on Judaism. and they compete with Christian Hebraists. They know Hebrew, right? They know rabbinic texts and so on. So Moses Marcus becomes a teacher to educated Christians in London. And you should see the list of his students are unbelievable. I mean, so he has become an intermediary. So there are no official Jews in England at this time, but he is essentially the intermediary between Jewish culture and this non-Jewish culture. I'll come back to this story in a second because I want to talk about another aspect of it. But so there are many like this, and what we have here, therefore, are a large population of individual converts. These are not conversos. These are not the same group at all. They're not converting en masse. Rather, they're converting as individuals. And the phenomenon we have now mostly for Western Europe, although now we have a new book that is just about to come out from Todd Endelman on conversion in the modern era, which brings us into Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, and so on. We have a recent book which is more modern, but again, the parallels are really quite interesting here. It certainly begins in the 18th century of Russian converts. By one of my students who just wrote her dissertation. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, Ellie, no?
Yeah, Ellie, thank you. Ellie.
Yeah, Schenker.
Ellie Schenker. Thank God you know her, because I couldn't remember her name. Who teaches at Emory University. And there, I mean, her stuff is absolutely remarkable because this is about conversion for love reasons for Jews and Christians and Orthodox, Christians and so on and so forth. The two of these people here were in a group for the whole year. We talked about converts and conversion. I mean, that was the topic of our year. So there are many, many dimensions to this. And I'm sure Javier will ask me a question about how 14th, 15th century Spain really parallels this precisely long before the early modern period. Which probably is the case. So I'll already give in before you even ask the question. So this is the third group. So now my fourth group, are Christian Hebraists. And there again, this is a big bag of all kinds of people. But these are Christians who are Christians. But they have a love affair with Jewish books. And we talked about them in part last time. I talked about Pico and so on, but I'm talking now about the whole, from the 15th century through the 18th and early 19th century. And I want to give you one very prominent example from my own work about that. But clearly we are speaking about the Kabbalah de Nudata. We're speaking about that group of people that translated the Kabbalah. But we're speaking about all kinds of Christian Hebraists who become deeply involved in the study of Christianity, many of them for academic reasons by the 18th century, but academic and private spiritual, it's very hard to separate. No one is purely academic and no one is purely spiritual. But clearly, again, we can't generalize here, but it seems to me the way to go is one by one, is to look at individuals who are making a kind of odyssey into Judaism. Now, what does this mean? In many respects, it means loving, as we said already, loving Hebrew books and not loving Jews at all, or creating a kind of relationship with a kind of mythic Jew that has nothing to do with the real Jew. Certainly, this is the case in England with the Christian Hebraists who are studying rabbinic texts and studying all kinds of things, but they're not encountering or rarely encountering Jews. But there are a few who actually go all the way and become Jews, or those who essentially develop a kind of Judaized version of Christianity. I mean, the question is, at what point do you become involved in Judaism as a Christian and not become a Jew? And I love to talk about them, particularly with my European colleagues, who most of them, I already told the story of Busi here. Did I tell that story?
No.
You sure I didn't tell the story? Stop me if I did. But when I was in Berlin, my colleague Giulio Busi, who is a Christian, Italian Christian who teaches Jewish studies at the Freie Universität, invites me over to come on Friday night for dinner. I didn't tell the story, and I said, sure, but I said, would you mind if I made Kiddush? The Jewish blessing of the wine. And he said, oh, of course, we'd be honored. And so I went to, he's a very fancy Italian. I wasn't going to buy Italian wine because I probably would get the wrong wine for him. He's a connoisseur. So I went and I bought a Spanish wine, actually, but I paid a lot of money for it, 20 euro or something. I figured I'm going to his house. The guy dresses in Armani suits, and he has a, what do you call it? What's the fancy car? Not a Mercedes, the other one. He has a Jaguar.
Oh.
But he picked me up in a Jaguar with his Armani suit, and I say to him, wow, you have a Jaguar? He says, it's only a baby Jaguar. Yeah. So this is a Jewish studies scholar, yeah. So I'm going to his fancy house. I mean, he lives in an unbelievable house. So I bought him. So I come to the door with my Spanish wine, and his whole department is there. All of his graduate students. You never heard the story, right? So I had bought this non-kosher wine. He had gone to the Jewish section of Berlin and bought a Jewish bottle of wine, horrible tasting wine. And forgive me, it was Israeli. It was fine. He'd bought Nachala, and they were lighting candles. Now they were sitting around the room, 10 scholars. They were all Christians who were studying Judaism. They were all his students. And they wanted me to do Shabbat. So, I lit the candles. There wasn't a woman there that could light the candles. And then I sang Shalom Aleichem, and then I did the Kiddush. And they knew all the words, but they didn't know any of the melodies because they're Christians. And I'm saying to myself, so what's this phenomenon of Christian Hebraicism? And they were really enjoying it. I mean, it wasn't like there was something that was foreign to them. So I don't know. I love to tell that story, but going back now to the 17th century, the 18th century, it seems to me that Christian Hebraicism is a very interesting phenomenon in many respects because you could still maintain the distinction between books and people, or books and culture. At the same time, quite often, our intellectual journeys affect our souls. They do. I mean, they have a deep impact. The fact that what we choose to study has something to do with who we are and what we believe in and what we're concerned with. And my argument is that Christian Hebraists in many respects had mingled identities. Certainly some of them were accused of being Judaizers. Certainly some of them were accused of getting too close to Judaism. And some of them were. Again, I don't want to generalize. There are all kinds of types here, and I think we have to look at them as individuals. But I think, having examined their biographies, you see the kind of tensions. In my one biography of Moses Marcus, clearly he's back and forth. He's not really sure who he is. And what is really interesting, in one of his books, he translates, there's a whole episode where William Whiston attacks, there's a whole, the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. A German scholar whose name escapes me from Leipzig publishes this big German work against this guy William Whiston, who's another very interesting character. He's Messianic. He's the one that translated Josephus, very involved with Jewish things and so on. But Whiston makes a strong argument against the Masoretic Bible. And that's why there's a need to create a new Christian Bible that doesn't rely upon the Jewish version of the Hebrew Bible. Marcus translates this German into English and writes an introduction in which he says, look, I found Jesus Christ. I love Christianity. But when my brethren, the Jews, are vilified and attacked because they were insincere about their translation, I need to rise and defend them. So it's an amazing text. I mean, they're his brethren. I mean, he's still a Jew even though he's a Christian. So that to me is a really wonderful example from a Christian side. Now, but let me give you now the Christian Hebraist who I think is the most interesting in this regard. And I'm still looking for someone to write his PhD on him. I've been giving it to all my grad students, but I haven't found yet. You have to know Latin really well. His name is Wilhelm Surenusius. Surenhusius. He was a professor of theology in Amsterdam at the end of the 18th, the end of the 17th century, the early 18th century. Did I talk about this at all, about the Mishnah? I did last week, right? I talked about him as well, or a little bit? All right, so I don't want to repeat myself, but basically, as I said last week, there was a 100-year project by a whole group of Christians to translate the Mishnah into Latin. And he publishes this remarkable text. So I think I did speak about him, so I'll do it very briefly, but he publishes the ultimate text of the Mishnah with the two Jewish commentaries, Bertanora and Maimonides, and his own. And then what follows, which I didn't talk about, was his disciple William Whiston in England, beginning to translate the entire Mishnah into English. So Surenusius then writes a work, you recall, I think I described this as well, where he describes the rabbinic hermeneutical principles and then applies them to reading the New Testament. And this is all about his interest in discovering, and his argument in the book, in the introduction to the Mishnah, is about how essentially to be a good Christian you need to know the Mishnah. And this is like Johann Kempfer, who I mentioned also, who says to be a good Jew you need to believe in Jesus Christ and observe the commandments. This is what he teaches Swedenborg. This is what he learns from Swedenborg. He goes to Sweden to teach Swedenborg. So we have both sides of the picture here and so on. Surenusius' book is really an amazing book of Jewish Christianity. I mean, it's a book about, to be a good Christian, you have to be a good Jew too. You can't separate the two and so on. Now, I just happen to have the text here, so maybe we should end with a text. In this group of individuals who were Surenusius' students in England, William Whiston translates 3 tractates of the Mishnah into English. And he goes to his friend Simon Oakley. Oakley is a very important figure in the intellectual scene. He is a professor of Islamic studies at Cambridge, and also translates into English Leon Modina's Riti, this manual of Jewish ritual that was originally written in Italian by the 17th century rabbi Leon Modena. He gets Oakley to write a preface, a letter, which a kind of approbation, a haskama, for his book. So here is a piece of it. It's an incredible text. We are obliged to you, speaking to William Whiston now, Simon Oakley is writing this, for having evinced beyond all contradiction that Hebrew learning is necessary for us Christians. If I'd ever had the opportunity, I would most certainly have gone through the New Testament under a Jew. In other words, I would have read the New Testament with a Jew. If I'm going to study the New Testament, I need a Jew. Whatever some of our gentlemen may think, this I am well assured of, that they understand it infinitely better than we do. They are thoroughly acquainted with all the forms of speech and all the allusions, which, because they occur but rarely, are obscure to us, though in common use, and very familiar among them, as has been admirably demonstrated by the learned Surenusius. So he quotes him at the end. I remember I had read in Father Simon. Now Simon was a very important Catholic Hebraist as well. I believe it is in his appendix. He was responsible for the French edition of Leon Modena. In his appendix to his Leon Modena, that he once offered the epistle to the Hebrews in Hebrew to a learned rabbi in Paris, who after he had perused it, without taking any manner of notice of the difference in religion, said that whoever was the author of that book, he was a great Mikubal, he was a great Kabbalist, and thoroughly versed in all the traditions of the Jewish nation. Notice how this is mixed identity all over the place, mingled identities, right? The argument drawn from the novelty of the Jewish writings against the usefulness of their learning deserves rather to be pitied than confuted. We do not make use, now he wants to separate himself, he doesn't want to get too Jewish, right? So he says, we do not make use of the opinions of modern rabbis, nor their uncertain conjectures for the confirmation of anything. So he's separating himself. We don't hang around with those modern Jews, over there in the shul. They're Jewish, right? But when we find expressions and allusions exactly the same with those in the New Testament, several petitions in the Lord's Prayer, and some of our Lord's parables in the Talmud. Now he's aware that the Jewish background of Christianity is critical for understanding Christianity. Are we to suppose that they came thither by chance, or which is most ridiculous, that the Jews borrowed them from the Christians, or rather, which is the only way of accounting for them, that they were in familiar use among the Jews in the biblical Savior's time? So I could go on here. It's really a very interesting letter, isn't it? But I mean, essentially, here is what this Christian scholar at Cambridge has discovered. That, if you want to know something about Jesus, you better know something about Judaism. Because he's a Jew. I mean, basically, this is the discovery of Jesus as a Jew. This is the fourth group here. And again, I'm not categorizing them as monolithic. They're all very different, and they all have different motivations and so on. But there's something going on. Now, if you put them all together, so converso, Sabbatean, individual convert, and Christian Hebraist, among four, and then there are probably others as well. What you get here is a remarkable hybridization, a remarkable synchronization going on here in terms of the mixing of cultures, the mixing of traditions. Jews are defining themselves within this background. Boundaries are being crossed, boundaries are being broken. This is upsetting rabbis. This is creating a havoc for the Jews, but it's also having an impact upon Christianity. This element of the Hebraic element entering Christianity, in other words, I don't want to it's really fascinating for me, all of the Christian scholars who are studying Christian Hebraism these days. But it is a factor in Christian identity. It's not just Jewish identity we're talking about here. It is rethinking Christianity in the light of its Jewish background on the one hand, but it's also thinking about Christianity in relationship to other religions in general, towards the other. Remember, at the same time, Christianity is exploring Hinduism and Confucianism and Islam. Notice the Islamic scholar at Cambridge is also a Hebraist. And I mentioned this connection as being a very, very important one. Christian Hebraism doesn't emerge in isolation, it emerges within the context of the study of the other religions. The greatest work of this era, according to Lynn Hunt and Margaret Jacob, is the book that changed the world, they call it, is a book by Picart, P-I-C-A-R-T, which appears under the auspices of Oakley. All these people are involved with this. They're all essentially a Huguenot who takes, he engraves all of the religions of the world. If you've ever seen this book, if you can find, I don't know if they have it in the library here. It is an amazing book of engravings of Jews, of Christians, of Muslims, of Hindus, and so on. And you look at this book and you see this is world religion. This is the emergence of world religion, of comparative religion. That's what we're talking about here. This is changing the way Christians are thinking about themselves in relationship to the other. The Picart book is extremely important for Jewish history because it portrays Jews. I have a Picart on my wall at home. Somebody gave it to, Yaakov Deutsch gave it to me as a present. No, you gave it to me.
I have one in my office.
Who gave it to you?
My brother.
Oh, your brother, okay, all right. But I think Yaakov Deutsch gave me the present. So we have Jewish weddings and Jewish funerals and Jewish bar mitzvahs and Jewish brit milah and all the Jewish holidays. And the Jews are portrayed just normally. There's no stereotype. There's no negative connotation. They appear as they are. In other words, Jews, a kind of ethnography. And this is part of the world that we're talking about. So I'm suggesting that this whole notion of mingled identities, therefore, is a very interesting phenomenon which affects Christianity. And probably Islam as well. I just don't know enough about it to talk about it with any kind of authority. So what we're seeing here is a world very much in flux, and a world that is very much like our own world in many respects, in terms of the way we interface with a variety of, having experienced recently a Hindu-Jewish wedding of my son, I can talk about mingled identities. In any case, but as you know by now, from me, all history is autobiography. So I had to bring myself into the picture, when I end this course. So basically, what I've done here, and our time is just about up. what I want to suggest is that the challenge of legal identities is really the most threatening aspect for the rabbis. So it's not just about their political authority and so on, their authority to control the Jewish community and to define orthodoxy, but it's to define what Judaism is against the other. In other words, to define Judaism in that it can't be hybridized, it can't be made into something else. It can't be made to be Jewish Christian or Jewish Muslim. You can't live in two worlds simultaneously. You have to define what you are. You can't believe in Jesus Christ and also believe in halacha, in Jewish law. That's what rabbis are saying today, and that's what the rabbis said then. But can you? I mean, that's the question. And the world that Jews are now entering, as we talk about the 21st century, perhaps that social reality is so different that I can hear. I wish Carmen was here. That rabbi speech that I heard in Toledo last week. If they have good values, if they care about reading and if they like wealth and so on, even if they're not Jews, we'll call them Jewish. I mean, that's a kind of that's a hybrid identity. In any case, what I want to argue then to finish this up is that these 5 factors play a role in understanding the period that I'm describing. Many of them, of course, continue in different ways in the modern era, but I'm not suggesting, I'm not claiming that they are leading to modernity. I want to understand them in their own right, within their own context. Clearly, and I want to argue, as I do very strongly at the end of the book, that modernity, therefore, is not such a radical break from the past. That this period that precedes it, there are certain changes taking place. And as Javier will remind me, of course, the early modern period is not such a radical break from medieval in some respects. I mean, in other words, historians have to emphasize both continuities and discontinuities and not see everything as being different. But I do think I think, again, in scale, the changes that I talked about, I think, are significant. Now, I must tell you, I have critics of the book, particularly those who study Eastern European Jewish history. They don't think I've given them, the Eastern European Jews, a fair share in this book, and that the changes are not as radical there because they continue to live within their own relatively insulated world. And therefore, is hybrid identities really that important for Eastern European Jews? And we could argue about that. In other words, these things don't happen simultaneously with the same intensity at every place and every time, of course. Mobility is a factor at a certain point and less in another period. Print is a very, print to me continues to play a growing and ascending role throughout, and it affects all communities, not just West and not the East and so on. But maybe it is a view of early modernity seen from the point of view of a historian who works, in Italy and England and in the West more than in the East. That's possible. And maybe there are other factors that we need to engage. This larger subject of the popularization of the Kabbalah in this period and its impact upon, Jewish perceptions is a factor that needs to be considered. Maybe maybe my view is too intellectual history and not enough popular religion. All these things are possible. The book is not an attempt to define absolutely the early modern period. It's simply a proposal to open up a discussion of what early modernity means. So it needs to be refined, to be criticized. That's all part of a good process. And as I had a wonderful discussion with Mercedes a couple of weeks ago, scholarship is never definite. As soon as we publish our book, someone's going to criticize it. That's the name of the game. So it's essentially, it's a statement of the field at a given moment, but that field is going to change and different questions are going to be asked and different answers to be offered. That's the name of history. History is not a science. And different texts, of course, will be discovered, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, hopefully this might give you an insight into my world. Of course, you can read all the bibliography and learn a lot more than what you got from me. But I've tried to do my thing, and I hope it was helpful.